Okay, I think, shall we get started, Gwen and Phil? We good? And Veronica? Great. All righty.
Do it.
Okay, let's do it. So hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Brown, and joining me today is Phil Clausen and Gwen Megida, and also Veronica Perillo on my team. And we have a really wonderful session in store for you today. And like I said, it's going to involve polling on your phone and Q&A on your phone as well using Slido. So some of you are probably familiar with Slido, but we have a lot of points of interactivity today planned for you on this topic. We want to hear from you. We want to make sure this session is really valuable for you. And so here's some more information about us up on the screen. And just quickly for some of you that don't know me, and then I'll kick over to Phil and Gwen. But I'm Jennifer Brown, and I focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in workplaces. And some of you may know my work and our team. And I'm fascinated with the topic we're going to talk about today because we're very passionate about building workplaces where all of us can feel valued and heard, and also play a role in creating more inclusive workplaces in the world. And when I think about corporate social responsibility and the purpose-driven economy and civil responsibility and the role of companies and organizations in the social justice conversation, I get very excited about the possibilities. And I'm with two experts on this today, Phil and Gwen, that you will learn so much from, and I always learn so much. So I'm going to present a little bit, and I'm also, Veronica, are going to make sure our interactive portions go well and are as seamless as possible. And so you'll hear me in sort of an SME, but also a facilitator role today. And some of you might have been in our sessions last year at Out and Equal. We did a big pre-leadership day, I think, on this session with Phil and Gwen, and it was a packed house, and it was super fun and interactive, and I thought was a really, exploring the intersection of these topics is really rich conversation, full of possibility for us to take a bigger role in defining it and driving it and championing it. So welcome, everybody. And let me hand over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. So I'm Phil Clausen. I lead CSR Lab. We're a corporate responsibility consultancy. And yeah, so I just wanted to echo what Jen said. So excited to be here with everybody. And I just want to congratulate everybody for making it to this point. I know we're all going through our own struggles in the current climate, whether it's with structural racism or COVID, or being stuck in a nondescript hotel room with a dog that decided to vacate everything a foot away from you, like, I don't know, 2.5 minutes ago, as is my case. So congratulations to everybody for making it through whatever you've made it through to be here today. And apologies in advance if I'm grimacing throughout this, or if you see my husband who's valiantly trying to clean up the carpet that's 1.5 feet away from me. So yeah, excited to be here with everybody. A little bit sad that it's not in person and we can't physically engage and interact, but we're going to try to make this as interactive as one can on a Zoom. And really excited to share some things with you and learn some things from you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, I am good to see some of you again this year. It's been quite a on again, off again year for me in the hospitality industry. I was furloughed and part-time with many of my colleagues for roughly half a year, but we've evolved and since added another title change after what you see on the screen. So I head up diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as philanthropy, community engagement, and sustainability. So my perspective here is really in practice and how we consolidated over the past 3 years and look at a different outcome of a strategy through a ROI lens as well at Caesars. Good to be joining you all today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Gwen and Phil. And so we'd love to hear from you a little bit more about who you are, what your title is, what industry you work in, and we'd also love to know your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, DEI&B, which is a mouthful, expertise, just to get a sense of who's in the virtual room today, and your level of CSR expertise. So Some of us have dual role and responsibility of this. Some of us have transitioned from one to the other, but we'd like to get a sense of from everybody of those sort of two hats that you might wear and what you'd like to leave this session with. So we have a little example at the bottom of the slide of what this sounds like. And so if you would jump into chat and give us some of this information, that would be extremely helpful. Thank you so much for doing that. And as we're collecting this info, we are getting ready.
Just to say, Jen, so we're going to use multiple systems today, but we're going to use the Zoom chat for chat and interaction. So don't add this to the Pathable chat because we're not looking at that. Add it here in the Zoom chat if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Wonderful. So Phil and Gwen and I will kind of check out what you all are submitting here for a moment and see who we have here. We've got a couple beginners on both, so that's helpful to know. We've got some intermediate and advanced. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Fabulous. Fabulous. Yes, Danny said it best. How to persuade data-driven senior leaders to invest in ERGs. Yeah, great point. Great point. I know we have a lot of thoughts about that, especially between the two experts we have today here.
Somebody else after my own heart, Casey Goldstein, said, numbers, numbers, numbers.
We have those for you today. Great, great. Oh, wonderful. Hands-on ideas and examples about how ROI has been quantified. That is the question. Yeah, so we've got some ideas and some real case studies from Phil and Gwen on that. And then there are some elements of how ERGs can then participate in that and drive some of those metrics as well. Relaying ROI of this to my senior leaders and also to entry-level employees. That's an interesting question. Thanks, Armani. How can we engage all levels of the organization in this in language that we all can understand and not just necessarily senior leaders? Making the case, wonderful. Business case, lots of business case requests. Great.
You all came to the right session. Yay.
Yeah, for sure. You're in the right place. Fabulous. Wonderful. And also what we're going to be talking about too is given how many ERG leaders and members we have today, CSR should be a part of that ecosystem that we are working on, right? That we are interacting with, that we have a relationship with, if that exists in our organization. And it can be a strategic pillar of focus in our ecosystem of stakeholder partners. I might argue, and I know we all would agree, it should be. It should absolutely be kind of hand in glove. And that, I guess, is the goal, but it sounds like from the chat and from my own experience that that's an aspirational goal. But much like supplier diversity, which I'm always mindful of as a woman-owned and LGBT-owned company, another pillar I wish ERGs would kind of look at and think about how can we contribute to that? How can we quantify progress? How can we create a closer relationship to drive more supplier diversity, right? So these are other sort of functional areas that exist around us where we could maximize those relationships, I think, more than we have. There's always room for improvement and progress. So this is great. Thank you, everybody. And if you can keep contributing in chat if you hadn't had a chance to, but we're going to move on and get you started with a poll. So if you would all go to Slido on your phone, tablet, whatever device you're using. And we have an event code L568. And this is where we're going to be interacting. As Phil said, this is the primary way we're going to be communicating with each other. So we have Q&A and we also have polls that we've sprinkled throughout the presentation today. And then in chat, we will save that for exactly that, right? Chat back and forth, plus ones, however you'd like to use that. But we will be keeping an eye on the Q&A specifically so that we make sure we answer your questions. And then that's where we'll be looking at the polls, and we'll also be we'll try to share the polls on the screen as well so you can see them as we go. Great. All righty, so our agenda today, we're gonna open with some perspectives, give some context to why this matters. We have knowledge mapping and sharing, sort of understanding from all of you what your understanding is of CSR and how do they intersect and drive ROI. We have case studies. Gwen will share how Caesars is a quite an advanced application, I think, of everything we're going to be talking about. And then we'll give you some time at the end for Q&A, and also to, if we have time, to kind of speak to each other about key takeaways and ideas that you've generated in this session. All right, so we'll just go on to the next slide. And I just want to say, as a positioning, what a year. It's like Phil said, our hearts are together in this community. Particularly, I wish we were in person because we need each other more than ever. But this feels good too, to just be in a space together at this conference, realizing how critical our voice is as the LGBTQ plus and allies community, in terms of advocacy, in terms of understanding marginalized identities and what it's like to be underrepresented in organizations, and the ability to have the voice that we've had in the organizational context this year has been unprecedented. I know all of you are, there are listening tours, there is close attention being paid to the feedback that's being received and the truth that is being told. And in our organizations, in many cases for the first time, we're having new conversations and we're connecting new dots, and we're gaining new participants in this conversation that we've never had before. So we can have a more holistic conversation about what needs to change. And I think the accountability is close behind, and that's my hope for all the organizations that are here today, the accountability to make change, to follow through on everything that we've been shown, everything that we've learned. Now the hard work begins, in a way, of driving what we've learned into behaviors, into organizational practices and policies, yes, into ROI, and thinking about how do we take this forward and incorporate all of this into DEI&B and also into CSR, right? And as those two things become more and more tightly connected. And so we've learned a lot this year. It has been really difficult, and yet I wonder if some of you agree, really incredibly illuminating and inspirational, and I dare say even hopeful, because it's never helped organizations that we haven't really heard from, many of us that we haven't told the truth about the challenges and headwinds that are faced by certain talent demographics. And I think the world is changing, and senior leaders understand this. And so as we talk about making the case for this work, I think we're dealing with in some ways a new threshold from which to make that case. And Phil and Gwen, I'll be really interested to hear from you. Are we now starting from a new threshold? It has something kind of taken a quantum leap, which means that we argue the case for this differently. Are we more equipped to make a powerful ask, for example, or is that, that accountability is going to flow more easily than it might have flowed before this year because of the environment that we're in and what we're going through and what we have been through. So, that to me, that's the question I'm sitting with. And if that resonates with you all, we're always happy to hear from you in chat. But there's a real opportunity here. And what I personally don't want to see is that we squander all that we've learned this summer, but that we take every single bit and we figure out how to construct compelling arguments in our organizations for progress, right? I mean, that's what our work is. And so this session will give you a lot of ideas about how to do that. And these two pillars of strategy, DEI&B and CSR, they complement each other in a beautiful way. And if you're coming into the session wondering how they complement each other, you're going to leave with a lot of information. So thanks. So next slide. So quickly, some of you may know my firm, Jennifer Brown Consulting. We focus on many things in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. One of the things is ERG progression. And some of you may be familiar with this, but it's a teaching tool we use. And as you think about where your ERG is, assuming many of you are in one, or you lead one, or maybe you're an executive sponsor of one, or maybe you're a program leader for DEI&B, where is your group in its maturity journey? And I just want to go through these quickly, and then we're going to ask you to kind of pinpoint where you are. And you can answer this in terms of your own ERG you're involved in, or if you oversee all of them, or you touch multiple ERGs, you can answer in the aggregate if that would be helpful. Foundational level is level 1, where we are literally just ad hoc coming together. We're trying to figure out who we are. We're not tied to the business case. We have no real strategy. We're very grassroots. We are about our, maybe our founder or co-chairs, that passionate first volunteer, and about their sort of objectives and vision for the network. And, you know, if you're just starting out, this is often where you are. And then as you grow, you become more formalized in level 2. You start to think about a more holistic strategy that connects to more than just the founding team. You start to build out your ally strategy. You start to think about, you know, what are our processes and repeatable management practices as an ERG, as we're formalizing our meeting schedules, our, you know, event processes, our one event turns into 4 events. We start to think about who are we beyond our events? You know, are we just about food, fun, famous people, cultural celebrations, food, flags? As we formalize, we start to ask, so I think, deeper questions about our contribution to the organization we live in. And we start to build out some kind of initial structure of leadership. And then as we move from formalized into functional is level 3, where we start to really operate as almost a business within a business, you know, that we have a strategy that connects to other business careabouts. And I think this is where I feel like our conversation today really lives, because in functional, we are a part of a larger ecosystem, and we are co-driving or help to drive other functional goals in the organization. We're starting to think about value propositions in multiple places. We're starting to, you know, operate as if we have a full structure. We have a more formal strategy, you know, and this is a crucial sort of pain point in the middle here. You get really squeezed almost because you've done such a good job that the ERG may be very overwhelmed at this point, you know, with all the opportunity and all the input and the participation that's wanted from us. When we move from 3 to 4, which is to integrated and really dynamic, these upper levels are extremely, especially dynamic is really unusual to see, but it's literally, you know, groups that are almost organizations within themselves, with tens of thousands of members, global, multiple chapters, multiple levels of leadership, you know, reaching even outside of the organization itself to the industry. And we see this in some really large companies where literally, you know, ERGs are creating thought leadership about industry practices. They're contributing to the field. You know, so it's really exciting to see how some networks have actually gotten to the integrated and dynamic phases. And I think that the arrows below, I just want to point out that something shifts at that functional level where we start to be really pulled into the table. You know, we've worked so hard to get a seat at that table. I think what happens is we start to get thought of, we start to be included, we start to be an essential part of decisions, whether it's product development or marketing or talent recruitment or retention. So it's a really exciting level. And so I would think about, as you mature your group, what is your relationship with the CSR function? You know, how do you think about that? How much do you understand about it? How much do you partner with that function or that effort or those initiatives? And do you see it through a DEI&B lens too? Because the CSR world needs our lens as much as we need theirs. You know, it's this beautiful opportunity to collaborate and really take each other to the next level. And so thanks. Some people are weighing in here actually on chat already of where we are. But we do have a poll on Slido as well. Could you please all go to Slido and answer your which level you're at? So we have the foundational, formalized, functional, integrated, and dynamic.
And for folks who are newer to Slido, there's 2 different tabs in Slido. There's Q&A and then there's polls. So Q&A is where you add your questions for us and then upvote each other's questions. So some folks have already started entering their answer to this question in Q&A, but there's a polls tab to answer the answer to this question, sorry. And then we will be sure to scrub some of these answers out of here and leave this as a space for questions to the panel. And also see in the chat questions about getting the PowerPoint afterwards. We will definitely upload that to the files section of Pathable. You can also email me through my email in the chat, and I'm happy to send you a copy or a PowerPoint version if that's more helpful than a PDF.
That's great. Thank you so much, Phil. Wonderful. So it seems, I think we're going to guess what the results are. We're getting a lot in chat about being at the functional level and the integrated level, which is not surprising given this conference and what I know about who comes. But yes, if you haven't answered that, go ahead and answer. And then thanks, Veronica. We're flashing up the result here. Great. So most are in functional, which is level 3. Great. So our guess is correct that you're all at that cusp, and I'm sure feeling the heat of being at that level of growing, maybe even growing more in the pandemic year, maybe growing more because of the Black Lives Movement. Maybe the membership is really increasing and there's a ton of interest and focus on the value proposition that you bring. And so perhaps you're coming to this session thinking about where else can we play? Like where can we have a voice and do some educating and drive some critical goals for the company, but through an intersectional lens, which is what we really bring that's so valuable. Fabulous. And are you surprised, Gwen and Phil, about the fact that we see mainly the functional audience here? Level 3.
No,
not at all.
Continue to be impressed with the attendees here. So it's a good average.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also it's not, I don't think it's a pejorative thing, right? Like, so,
No.
levels, we're all striving for greatness, and a lot of us work at companies that have a culture of we must be number one. And so, I think it's good to have a progression model that shows that there's room for improvement for everybody. So I would be disheartened if a majority put themselves at level 5. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that wouldn't be realistic.
Too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. I was going to say it's not a static piece too, right? As you go through I see it more of a circular, right? When you have turnover or new leadership, you might move back down to formalize, and then at a later stage get to dynamic, and you have transition issues. It's like an accordion that I'm seeing between our 7 ERGs.
Don't be discouraged. It is, like Gwen says, it's an iterative process, and don't be too self-congratulatory, because changes in org structure can definitely change how you're positioned. And you all probably have gone through that if you're lucky enough. And, I think the rebuild that you have to do then is really a great opportunity to build maybe smarter. Every time we go through this, we might do it differently based on what we've learned, right? And benchmarking with other companies and everything. So great. And we have some good comments in chat here. Some of you are starting to be brought into broader efforts. This is wonderful. You're building your brand. And then somebody has a co-chair who works in the CSR social commitment function. So that's an incredible lens to have in an ERG leadership team. Incredible. All right. Thank you for that. All right. Next slide. All right. So I think we are transitioning, Phil, to you next. Is that right?
Yeah, we are.
Wonderful.
So a lot of questions in the chat about what is CSR and what are all these dang acronyms. As Jen said earlier, we're partially, I think that the key aim for us in this session is we have a lot of folks on this session who care about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, care about impact on the world, and want to be able to make the case to others in their company who may not necessarily care as much or know that they care in a way that can unlock resources and allow us to do more and help the world in more ways and help our organizations in more ways. So we're all on a learning journey together. I've pulled together a model that I've used in the past to help companies think about what their impact is on the world and how it can generate value for them and how it can generate value for the world. And so don't be scared by this model. It's a little complicated, but we'll blow through it really quickly and then get to the good stuff, which is the ROI. So next slide, please. So this is the model. It's an intersecting lens where the innermost lens is what the company is doing in the world. And the middle lens is where the ROI is, and the outer end is what's the impact on the world. And again, we want to do this so that you can have more impact and make the business case to be able to have more impact. And also, there's a lot of intersections between corporate responsibility and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And ERGs and BRGs can be a great leverage point to help those intersections be more powerful. So next slide, what the heck is CSR? Apologies, Veronica, this is a build, so you can just click through till all the circles are showing. But oftentimes when people think about corporate social responsibility, we think philanthropy, donations of products and services, and employee volunteerism, and that is what folks think is corporate social responsibility, and it certainly is a key element of it. But corporate social responsibility also can encompass the impact we have on the planet, our environmental sustainability, which can be things connected to climate and water and waste, among other things. And it can also include our ethics and how transparently we share our performance on these and other matters publicly. Another bucket or silo, often unfortunately, of CSR and organizations is how we treat our employees around fair pay, around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, around safety, which is becoming more and more thrust into our consciousness in this era around COVID. And then perhaps most powerfully, the last two categories, which companies that are far on their evolution on the CSR continuum focus on. One is how we leverage our relationships and how we catalyze our suppliers and customers up and down our value chain, which means motivating and helping others to act and impact the world. And then lastly, whether and how we integrate social purpose into our core business, our products and services, our processes and operations. How ingrained is it in what the company does, how the company makes money? So we want to do a little bit more interactivity. So we can go to the next slide. So there's a new poll, or there should be a new poll on the Slido, which is, what elements of corporate social responsibility does your organization prioritize? And this should be multiple choice, and you should be able to select more than one. So if you just don't know, you can take a guess, or you can leave it blank. But if you have a sense of where you think your organization focuses its efforts around corporate social responsibility, take a click through there, and then let's see where we map out as a group. And while you're doing that, and before we show the results, I'm going to start. I just want to give you time to do that, but not take too much of our time. So if we can go to the next slide, and then we'll toggle back and show results. But I want to talk a little bit about where there are some overlaps and connections between diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and these different buckets of CSR. So on the environmental sustainability front, and Veronica, if you can hit the next, it's a build, sorry. It's just one build on each of these slides. But we can look at what the company's environmental impacts are on the developing world, on economically challenged communities and communities that are predominantly of color or LGBTQ, and look at, are the impacts disproportionate? So we can look through a DEI lens at any of these buckets of sustainability and corporate responsibility, and ERGs can play a great role in helping to make sure that that lens is applied. So I think have we had enough folks do the poll to show some results? So it looks like, I don't think this is going to shock anybody, but in the lead right now is people internal, right? And so a lot of the folks who are on this Zoom at this conference are in some sort of diversity role, whether within an ERG or within the organization. And so that's obviously a lens that's super important right now, more than ever, and going to be top of mind. But we also see that companies are focusing on ethics and transparency heavily. Core business, that's great. Would love to hear some examples of how companies are integrating CSR into their core business. Reach out to me offline. Love to learn more about what others are doing. And environmental sustainability and money, resources, and time. And pulling up the rear of the train is catalyzing value chain, which I think is not surprising either. And when we get to that slide, I'll explain a little bit about where the real power is there and why that's so important. So thanks everybody for that. Let's toggle back to the deck. This is so seamless. Veronica, you're amazing. All right, so next slide. So The next category is money, resources, and time. And we can think about, how does philanthropy and volunteerism and in-kind donations support diversity, equity, and inclusion goals? Do the business resource groups, employee resource groups inform any grants? And how can the business resource groups support and amplify volunteerism? And then finally, when we think about supplier spend, how much of a commitment are we making to supporting Black-owned businesses, supporting women-owned businesses, supporting LGBTQ-owned businesses, and putting some supplier spend and some money there where our mouths are around diversity, equity, and inclusion to achieve some social impact. The next pool is ethics and transparency. And this one has a hidden little thing that I think is really important, but it includes how transparently the company is reporting on the DEI goals and performance. So if there's a goal around pay equity for gender and for race, is the company being transparent and sharing where they're at in that journey, and how much of a challenge it is, so that they can have some accountability there. Sunlight is the best disinfectant is a often used phrase in the sustainability and corporate responsibility space. And then, do corporate policies positively or negatively impact DEI? For example, if there are overseas opportunities in your company for LGBTQ leaders, what if those are in unfriendly countries, and how is that managed and dealt with? And then finally, and I think this one is really important, and we've seen this in the LGBTQ+ community, is that advocacy and lobbying, when it overlaps with DEI, is a real powerful lever companies have to create change. So is the company which already is doing lobbying, almost every company does, are they integrating DEI into their lobbying? Are they lobbying against RFRAs? Are they lobbying for pro-equality measures? Are they lobbying for racial justice? Or are they just using their lobbying to try to make their tax situation or their business climate a little more friendly to their success? So that's another key thing. And ERGs are more increasingly getting pulled in to help companies think about, well, which of these pieces of legislation should we be weighing in on, and which of these candidates should we be backing? And then consumers are increasingly looking at what companies are doing from an advocacy space. Are you saying you're doing all this great DEI stuff or great CSR stuff, and then lobbying to kill climate change legislation, or to not to advance equality goals? So from a transparency perspective, this matters as well. All right, next slide. So the people section, this is where the most obvious intersections are for DEI, the company's core DEI efforts, goals, and performance, but also whether there's a culture of belonging. We did a great exercise last year when we did this session. We asked everybody in the room to raise their hand if their company scored a 100 on the HRC Corporate Equality Index. And almost every hand went up, right? Huge surprise given that we're at the Out and Equal conference. But we then asked everybody to raise their hand if they felt like they could be their full, authentic self at work and still be successful. And almost no hands went up. And that's about a culture of belonging. That's about more than just ticking the boxes and having the right policies in place, but that's about really having a culture of inclusion and belonging and equity. Fair pay, et cetera, right? So there's lots of obvious connections in the people pillar of CSR and DEI. Next, please. And then leveraging value chain. So this one scored the lowest in terms of what companies are already doing, but this is where we can perhaps have the greatest impact that we can have. So are we supporting and investing in diverse suppliers, and not just using them, but supporting their success, helping connect them to resources, helping connect them to expertise, helping them grow and survive this pandemic, helping them thrive? What's the situation around health, safety, and equity of DEI constituencies in our value chain, and our suppliers, and in our customers and use of product? How are we amplifying positive impacts or minimizing negative impacts on those populations? What are our customer diversity efforts around marketing, around access and fairness? It's not just about throwing up a rainbow on the LinkedIn page every June, but it's about having marketing and advertising, but then also access and fairness for a financial services institution. Are we making sure that LGBTQ people of color and other people of color have equal access to our services and aren't being charged predatory rates and things like that? and then leveraging our marketing to drive DEI. And then I think one of the most powerful things that we can do, particularly as large companies that have complex value chains, a lot of our value chains are small and medium-sized businesses, and they don't have the expertise and the bandwidth to figure out and then embed DEI best practices. So what are we doing to help our suppliers, often small and mid-sized businesses, learn from what we've learned and implement what we've implemented? I've seen some great examples of Bank of America and some other companies creating toolkits for other companies. But what are we doing to bring the 50% of global GDP that sits in small and mid-sized businesses and don't necessarily have these resources, helping them and all of their employees and all of their further down the value chain also live these values? Next slide. So business practices. So again, this is what the impact is of our products, our services, our processes, the life cycle of our products on the health, happiness, prosperity, and well-being of people across the diversity spectrum. And this is adding the DEI lens into the design process. This is providing access to people across the diversity spectrum, and making sure that everything that we do as a business, the core of our business, is maximizing equity and inclusion and belonging for people. I think that concludes this. Sorry, I flew through that really quickly. Hopefully that gives people a deeper sense of what CSR is and what it can be. It looks different in every organization. Some organizations, only focus on one or two of these pillars. Some have a little bit of focus on all of them, but it lives in different parts of the organization. But it's all a journey and it's all an evolution. If we can just move on and do another little Slido poll. So go back to the Slido, and there should be a new activated poll here. How does DEI intersect with CSR in your organization? So I showed a bunch of the overlaps, but what are you aware of in your organization? Again, you can click as many of them. I think, is this one a text or a multiple choice? I can't remember.
This one is a text. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So this is where you start telling some of your stories. So add in some insights, or it can be short and pithy, but where have you seen intersections between DEI and CSR in your organization? If you're part of an ERG, where have you been pulled in around advocacy or around philanthropy or around environmental justice or around marketing and communications and reporting and those aspects as well. So share that all with us here, and we'll start sharing a couple of your responses here. Sorry, if we were in a room, we would have everybody call things out and we'd break people up into small groups, but we're in the Zoom room, so here we are.
Phil, I have a question. It's Jennifer. What do you think the single biggest challenges in terms of creating these intersections between these two? Since many of us sit on the D&I side of the equation.
Yeah.
What do you think, like the one, and Gwen, I'd love to hear your thought too, as we're doing this poll.
I think the biggest challenge is silos and relationships, or lack of relationships. And I think it's one of the things that ERGs are greatly positioned to help disrupt. But the folks who run these different aspects of a company, the folks in legal who are dealing with advocacy issues, the folks who are in sustainability or ESG dealing with sustainability issues, the folks in HR who are dealing with talent issues, they often are siloed and aren't connected necessarily to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so they don't necessarily have that lens. So it's building relationships with those folks and making sure that that lens has a seat at the table, helping educate them so that they have that lens on, and then also being part of that conversation. And Gwen, I'm curious as to your thought on that too.
Yeah, I think added to that, even if you have that lens, how do you make it stick, right? Because there's so many people are so interested in this intersectional approach. I mean, if they are, right, internally in the organization, but they don't have the accountability or the responsibility to influence something beyond, say, one initiative or one campaign or several events. So I think that stickiness to strategy is a huge shift, I think, if companies are going to get deeper in these various areas.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Like the ROI of CSR and the ROI of DEI are incredibly heavily overlapped, and we're going to get to that in the next section. But the more we can make the business case that these things help the company thrive and succeed, from a talent, from an innovation, from an opening up new markets, from a whole bunch of different perspectives, the more sticky it'll be, because companies, whether they care about it from an intrinsic perspective or not, care about generating more value for the company, for shareholders, for owners, if it's a private company, and so that usually gets people's attention if you can drive and communicate the ROI. So there's some great answers in here. You know, diversity in clinical trials for a pharma company, that's huge. I saw a bunch coming up through here of, we're not really that integrated, which is the typical, you know, volunteerism, ERG members dealing with foundation grants, sponsorships, things like that. Oftentimes where we see the greatest overlap is that ERGs will have a small philanthropy budget, and they can give out a few, you know, grants to NGOs that are connected to their particular domain, but or volunteer with those organizations. But I'm seeing some other great examples in here. One thing that we'll do for folks who asked for the deck is we will create some slides where we add the content from these Slido polls into the deck. So you'll also have access to each other's responses. So hopefully that'll be of some value and help as well. So this is great. We are about at our halfway point, a couple minutes shy of that. I'm going to talk, the three of us are now going to talk a little bit about ROI, and then Gwen is going to do a case study on Caesars, and then we're going to have some time for Q&A and maybe a little bit more interaction at the end. I just want to tee up the ROI section by saying that there is a massive interest in this in the investment community right now, in CSR, in DEI. The CEO of the largest investment management company in the world, BlackRock, that has more than $6 trillion in assets under management, they send out a letter annually to the CEOs of other companies that they invest in. And for the last few years, that letter has included a call to social purpose. And he's basically said, figure out how to not just be profitable, but also to have a real social purpose, or we may not continue to invest in your company. That gets some attention in investor relations and the CFO and the CEO suite, right? So there's pull and push internally and externally in this direction. Next slide. So the way that I think about it, and again, this is just a model, others think about it in different ways, and that's fine, but this is just a way to add some lenses to think about what are we creating and what are we potentially missing. But I think CSR and DEI can create 10 pools of value or ROI for a company. There's the set that are the direct, sorry, Veronica, this is still a build, so if you could just click them all in here, that would be great. So there's the direct ROI, which is corporate performance. That's your stock performance. That gets a little bit to the Larry Fink letter in the prior slide. There's efficiencies. So a lot of the environmental sustainability efforts generate efficiencies. You use less energy, you use less water, you create less waste, you save money, right? So that's an ROI. New products and markets. This has a lot of overlap in the DEI space as well as in the sustainability and CSR space. If you start focusing on marginalized communities and adding value to them, you potentially open up new markets. Unilever did a big effort to focus on the bottom of the pyramid, and they now get, I think, over 50% of their new product growth and half of their sales from developing markets. And they're adding value, right? Their signature bottom of the period product is Purit, which is a countertop water purification system in India, Africa, and Latin America, right? So new products and markets, you have to be careful that you're not being, you know, you're not hurting the communities that you're trying to, you know, access, but and then increased sales. There's a whole bunch of data, and honestly, for anybody who's really interested in the data that backs up the ROI in all these pools, we don't have enough time to go through all the studies and show it all, but I have like a 100-slide deck that includes a ton of examples where companies have measured the actual ROI, or academics have measured the ROI in these different pools. I'm always happy to have a conversation with folks and share that. So reach out to me directly after if you want or need the more nitty-gritty on this. And then challenges solved. Sometimes by trying to have greater CSR impact on the world, you can actually solve one of your own business challenges. And I have examples of that as well. So then if we can click through to the rest of the indirect ROI, and the direct ROI, it's really easy to put dollars and cents to that stuff. And oftentimes people feel that for the indirect ROI, these are a little fuzzier and harder to add hard numbers to of the ROI, but it's not actually, it is harder, but it's not true that you can't, right? So there's massive potential ROI in the brand, image, and reputation sense. And then in the innovation sense, there's a bunch of ROI research on DEI and innovation, but also on CSR and innovation, and companies that focus on their impact on the world and seeing it through different lenses and focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in real meaningful ways unlock new pools of innovation, because more diverse sets of people at the table have different ideas and look at things from different angles. And so just by default, it does that, but there's research that backs this up. And then talent, there's a ton of research that shows that talent wants to work for companies that align with their values, and that so it increases attraction and retention of top talent, it increases morale, it increases engagement, and reduces turnover. There's like dozens of examples of research around that. And then key influencers, sometimes, if you're in like an extractive business, gold mining industry, found stakeholder relations could heavily influence land permitting, taxation, and the regulatory environment in a study. And then risk and license to operate. I think we're seeing that increasingly now, where companies that have fallen down in the past on diversity, equity, inclusion, or CSR have actually, taken on a huge amount of risk and cost associated with that. So there's a ROI of risk avoidance, and then there's also the ROI of just getting to continue to exist as a company. And oftentimes companies that have failed because of something around ethics or something around brand and reputation, something within this milieu. So just the next slide, please. I just want to share, there are some folks who are doing really interesting research on this and also creating tools. So my friend and colleague, who actually all three of us know, Dan Aronson, has a firm called Valuetus, and he created a tool to value the talent-related benefits of acting on values. And I use this with him with a large pharma company and helping to make the case for some really aggressive ESG goals that we're going to require about about $500 million in investment to achieve those goals over the next 10 years. And through using this calculator and other calculators, and if you just hit next, I think it'll play a little video of this. We worked with their finance and CFO team to make sure that the assumptions were all correct, but to figure out what the real ROI to them was of achieving this leadership position in ESG. And we came up with about $1 billion in $1.1 billion in ROI. About 400,000 of that was direct ROI through increased efficiencies and lower costs of less energy and et cetera. And about 700,000 of it was just around the talent benefits of becoming a sustainability and ESG leader. So again, happy to connect folks to Dan, but there are other resources as well. And there are lots of folks who care a lot about this and want to help companies and individual leaders in companies make this business case so that we can do more for the world. McKinsey and Deloitte have done a ton of research on this. So we've captured a few things here. Dan Aronson, Aronson. I'll throw it into the chat when I'm done talking too. And then with a link to his page. Veronica, we can go to the next slide. So McKinsey has done a ton of research and work on the ROI of DEI. A couple of salient things that they've published recently. There's a $12 trillion addition to GDP if the gender gap is narrowed by 2025. Sort of a macro ROI, not for a specific company. But there's also $2 billion in potential revenue if financial inclusion efforts broaden to include Black Americans, right? And then they also did a recent thing where they looked at the biggest opportunities in the current climate with the economic recession and challenges that we're facing and COVID. And it's the same as the opportunities that they've seen for the last 4 years that they've been studying this: winning the war for talent, improving the quality of decision-making, increasing customer insight and innovation, driving employee motivation and satisfaction, and improving a company's global image and license to operate. And there's some folks who asked for some data and numbers. So next slide. This is also from McKinsey. And they have at 3 points in 2014, 2017, and 2019, looked at the likelihood of financial outperformance for companies that have greater gender diversity and greater ethnic diversity. And this is all in their stuff on their site. You can Google McKinsey Diversity Wins. You go to their diversity page and it has a link to all these studies, but it's shown that it's actually increased. And when this says likelihood of financial outperformance, that means that the company is literally more profitable. It makes more money against its peer set. And so these are the types of arguments that I think can help unlock more attention and more resource from C-level executives. So we're throwing them in here, but there's way more than we could ever possibly cover in this session. Next slide, please. So Deloitte has also done some good research on this, and I stole this from the Bank of America session yesterday. If you didn't go to the one that Christian and Xenia led, but they found a 2x on meeting or exceeding financial targets, a 3x on high performing, a 6x on being more innovative and agile, and an 8x on achieving better business outcomes. Again, we can't really cover it in enough depth in this, but yeah. So next slide. They also did a financial calculation on this as well. So everybody who looks at the deck later can look at this, and you can also go back and watch their session. It was great. So now, Jen, I'm going to hand it back over to you for a little bit more on ROI, and we may be able to fly through some of these as well.
Yeah,
I think we may have covered some of them. Yeah.
Thanks, Phil. There was a request in chat, Phil, for is there any equivalent to the Corporate Equality Index in the CSR world? And I know there's a ton, but maybe if you could share some favorites, that would be fabulous. And then if somebody could share the Women in the Workplace study in chat, that would be great as well. I think they just came out with the latest. So yeah, it's incredible. So yeah, thank you, Phil. That was, wow, so much. There's so many angles to investigate. No, it was fabulous. It just tickles the brain. And I think, apologies for everyone if you're sort of just warming your engine up, it's a lot. But I hope you feel, especially, reviewing this later as we share the slides, that, you're going to have a lot of ideas to work with, even if you pick a few and really try to focus on them. So D&I matters. This slide shows how we teach the pillars of D&I. And so I think it harkens back to a lot of what Philip was just saying, which is the workforce is a key pillar, obviously. The workplace, which is the environment in which that workforce can thrive or not, right? And we're talking a lot about that these days. And then the marketplace, right? So products and services and customers and clients. And so, already we can see that there's a lot of really amazing overlap to leverage between what Phil was just talking about. And I think the D&I, the common pillars that we recommend clients focus on. So next slide. So exclusion is costly, and shameless plug, we're doing a session actually at, I think, 4 o'clock Eastern next on the cost of covering in organizations. And I'm going to be reviewing some of Kenji Yoshino and Christy Smith's work with Deloitte on uncovering talent in the next session that I'm doing with Shailene Jackson. But in a nutshell, engagement is chronically low. And how I see that, knowing what I know about D&I, is that its engagement is low partially, or perhaps in large part, because of how employees who are underrepresented feel in those workplaces, right? We're not able to reach our full potential. We don't see role models. We aren't fostered and supported in intentional, in equitable ways, right? That will bring that playing field more to level. And so when I see engagement numbers, I think diversity and I think inclusiveness or lack thereof. And I think about the culture and how difficult it is to be in a place built that isn't built by and for so many of us. And I particularly see it through the generational lens as well, of the most diversity of all kinds lives in that bottom part of the workforce pyramid, and I think struggles the most with these structures that were built a long time ago, workplaces that weren't built by and for so many of us, struggling against that to try to shift it, right? So fundamentally, I think when we see diverse talent falling out of the pipeline and not making it up to the C-suite, I think about these statistics and how costly this is. And, we know anecdotally, all of us on this call, because we know, we feel this ourselves. Maybe we're closeted at work, or we know a lot of other LGBTQ plus people that are. And we also know that intersectionality really plays a role too, that it's not just being LGBTQ plus, it's being a person of color, it's being a person with a disability. It's all of the intersections of our differences too, that have a cumulative effect on our engagement and our productivity and our happiness and ability to thrive. So very costly. And I don't think business leaders really understand this. So we can't make this point often enough. And if we think of people as a sustainable resource, when we think about corporate social responsibility, to me, this is not just the external world, right? It's what we do by our people. We are a resource to be used up and thrown away, or cherished and valued and invested in. And we are, our sustainability really matters in terms of the results and the ability to generate ROI for the companies that we work in. So next slide. And thanks, there's good stuff being shared in chat. So the millennials, the oldest of whom are reaching 40 years old, and then Generation Z coming in. And I just shared a report on Generation Z in the chat. Generation Z, the oldest of whom are about 25, I think, and somebody can correct me if we have any social scientists on here. But that, the expectation of organizations being places where we can bring our full selves to work and we don't have to compromise our authenticity is very strong in this generation as a core value. And so if companies think they're going to just be able to keep their head in the sands, or think it's a trend, or, I love to be able to point to that this is not going away. And I think this year has really shown us how the staying power of this conversation, and it's up to us to keep this conversation hot. So next slide. And of course, we should all on this call know these kinds of business case statistics. We should all know these, and we should be able to use this as the data that many people were asking about in the chat earlier, for that executive or that decision maker who may not get the moral case for a lot of what we're talking about, but needs to understand how it hits the business, right? And so, and like Phil said, there's a lot on this online, so I won't take a ton of time to go into this, but Google these things and you'll see there's like plentiful information to use. And I believe we have to have a lot of arrows in our quiver in terms of how we make these arguments. It really depends to me, how people are persuaded. And that is as different, we are each different from each other in terms of what's going to really create that light bulb moment and that aha, right? So some people need data. Some people need a powerful personal story. Some people think they're like, not keeping up with their competitors. There's all kinds of things you can utilize to get the attention on this, but there's no shortage of data to make these arguments. And the next slide. Thank you. Great. So I think this is going back to one of you, Phil and Gwen, I believe.
Yep.
Great.
So this is intentionally unbranded here, but I can see that, when we approach the ROI piece, oftentimes I'm asked, how does this relate internally, right? They see a lot, they being investors, CFO types, will see a lot of external data, but our approach here at Caesars was about how do you internalize this side and how do you evolve a long-standing 10-year DEI strategy into functions, into actionable outcomes. So I'm not going to go through each of these pieces, but for example, around, let's just take marketing, branding, and sales, right? So if there is a piece around revenue growth generation and targets, we have folded this actual few $1 million into our small department targets as well. How will our team help to build targeted goals around guest parity amongst different multicultural markets? And what would our role be? Going back to the D&I and CSR functions as well, and looking at parity amongst, say, domestic Korean, Vietnamese, and Mandarin-speaking Chinese in our markets, and how does that relate to LGBT customers or identified customers or mainstream customers as well. So each of these are essentially drilled down into from an aggregated KPIs for the company. I'm not going to dig through this deeper, but just to give you a lens of responsibilities by type of KPIs that essentially ladder up to the next slide, which is, if you get forward to the next slide. But if I were to show something to a board member or investors or owners, it would be something like this, right? It would look at to what extent are programming collectively making money or saving money, right? So some of them might be open to the value enhancing side, right? So it's about how does, say, purpose-driven workplaces help to drive efficiencies or drive retention and development in the workplace. That would be the value enhancing area. So some of the numbers that you saw in earlier slides at McKinsey, we also looked at internally by top performing and lower performing properties, and so the percent difference in terms of revenue generated by more diverse locations. But I think the piece that we have really tried hard to shift through over the years is, these are not real numbers, FYI, but it is similar. Let's look at revenue and cost savings, right? So DEI, to what extent that our group, including the ERGs, help to influence revenue. For us, it might be new total reward loyalty card signups, right? And to what portion of them that these ERG volunteers convert them into players. In our case, it might be casino players. To what extent they would convert them into more loyal customers. And you can look at this over a period of 5-8 years, and how a ERG volunteer will help to drive direct impact around our business being very heavily around loyalty and direct marketing. Another revenue increase might look at, we had some of our ERGs participate in promotions, helping to shape promotions, helping to give feedback on it into a more broader CSR lens. Last year's situation might have been around, say, hunger and nutrition with Meals on Wheels. To what extent that the ERGs with our group, the D&I with CSR, identify new customers through new customer signups, but also greater play in the casinos through customers wanting to be a part of something bigger than the company and a bigger ideal around a Meals on Wheels partnership. Just some examples around promotions and marketing. In terms of cost savings, probably the easiest numbers to count are probably around efficiencies. If you're looking at efficiencies that say how the environmental aspects and facility aspects relate to, say, behavior changes, and to, for us, it's around the Code Green operating efficiencies piece. But we also found through work, when you look at supplier diversity, and there's an often, I would say, myth that sometimes working with diverse suppliers costs more money, but we've been looking at how working with diverse suppliers actually saves money, because it creates more innovation, it creates more competition in those RFPs. And so we're looking at how you identify in real numbers and real case studies internally on working with diverse certified suppliers actually reduces the cost of doing business. So I think that is a very important linkage for the CFO types. So what I tried to do over the past 3 or 4 years was essentially look at, there's so many different, I would say there's hundreds of different KPIs you could look at, right? What are the most impactful in terms of where the company's business strategy is, right? For our case, in the last 5 years, it might have been growth in domestic and international markets, but it also might have been growth or regaining competition in multicultural marketing in the US, right? So if that's the case, I'm going to, reverse engineer in our updated DE&I goals and looking at, to what extent is our department looking at a chunk of this giant goal around, say, cost savings, or this giant goal around revenue. And from there, we link it and tie in the ERG piece as one aspect. The D&I function as another aspect as well. But making sure that whatever you provide as ROI is really clear, simple, believable. And if it's a CFO who is the biggest naysayer, and I'm not saying that it's our CFOs, but if you have people who want to know, does this pass the red face test? If the CFO goes out on, let's say, a investor tour or speaking to other CFOs, we have to speak in their language. So our translation is around revenue increase and cost savings. And it's just all of those pieces that you saw earlier essentially ladder up to something very simple and aggregated for an ROI. I'm going to pass the torch to for the next slide, and then I'm going to speak a bit later on a case study around Caesars.
Great. Yeah. So the next is another open input, and again, this will be helpful as an output in the deck for others. But if you can go back to Slido in the polls section and share what is or could be the return on investment of either diversity or CSR at your company, either aspirationally, theoretically, or things that you've actually tracked or measured, that would be super helpful. And then also remember, in the Slido section, there's the Q&A as well, and you can upvote each other's questions. So take a look in the Q&A section, because we're getting closer to the Q&A section, and upvote folks who you think, questions that you want answered, or add your own. And we'll try to answer as many of them as we can when we get to that section. All right, do we have some answers coming in? Oh, it's so good to temporarily see so many of your faces as we go to the Zoom here. Hey, Bobby. All right, so decrease in turnover, brand and reputation, value to employees and to the community, how the company is viewed, better engagement, gaining more new customers. These are all great. If anybody has actual examples of where your company has measured the ROI of diversity, equity, inclusion, or CSR, please feel free to email them to me, and I'll use them in other presentations and give some kudos and attribution to your company if you want it, or make it anonymous if the company isn't comfortable sharing that. All right, so keep adding these in here, and then just because we're crunched for time a little bit, let's toggle back to the deck. And so just to sum up the model, you can just click through this to build it. We've got the 6 different components of CSR at the center, the internal ROI in the middle, and then the external impact, which is another really important lens that we didn't talk about today, but I think is really key to think about what's the impact on the world of these things that we're doing, so that we're not just doing things for show, but we're doing things to make the world a better place, to make people's lives better, to make the planet more healthy, etc. Next. And I think we're on to Gwen's case study with more from Caesars.
Great. So I think maybe if I had started a little bit more around context, that would have helped earlier. So just to kind of give you guys a perspective, we can move to the next slide. Really how over the last 3 years, our previously separately managed with separate KPIs were consolidated into this range of this broader strategy around social responsibility. And for us, it ranges from the required, right, the compliance side, into the leading edge side. The slide that you saw earlier on the KPIs are really something that's translated and consolidated for a CFO type. Right? So if it's more of a translated into the aggregate numbers on data. But in terms of strategy and functions, the 5 functions that used to be operating separately are now under my area. Everything from, say, for us, it's responsible gaming, right? Although in some of these areas, you might have an owner such as risk and safety that sit in another area, but as in aggregate, we're the shepherds, the owners, the orchestrators of a broader social and environmental responsibility strategy for the company. And in many ways, it also includes the governance aspect of, we call it the policy processes and procedures that are voluntary or required internally with the company as well. So this was how we look at an intersectional approach, our actual strategy for CSR as this range of attributes and functions within it. Go to the next slide. And how this translates to the people side, for us, we look through a combined approach around giving employee-led programs, that right clearly around environment. That's pretty clear. Around the guest piece as well, we do have aspects of equity and inclusion on the guest-facing side, but more so heavily around safeguards around responsible business and responsible gaming. Our bigs are essentially ERGs for us. So the employee side, it's not really a pillared approach in reality, because the bigs do have required objectives for community, for guests as well, in their annual plans that they submit to our department. Philanthropy hero, pretty clear, but when we saw, now that we're in year roughly 10 or so of the active ERGs, we have about 7 of them. We saw a lot of them are naturally gravitating to this area around philanthropy volunteerism. So we try to ensure that of the ERG objectives, we have a very finite and refined expectation around their role for into company philanthropy and volunteerism. For example, if there is a partner that works around victims of counter trafficking, some of the bigs such as Savvy, which is women, this ERG, we basically fostered a partnership between the big and the philanthropic partner. Some of you were asking about, say, voting rights or others earlier. ACLU is a partner of ours in some of the states. Some of the ERGs have that level of interest in terms of ACLU as well. So we ensure that there's a direct connection into that philanthropy policy relationship as well, through their community and through their expectations in being present and being supportive of those in that state of operation. I'm going to switch to the next slide, if you could, Veronica. This is some examples that we updated. So many of the signature initiatives were essentially started by Caesar's ERGs. Everything from what would have been the 2020 APIA Town Hall was started by an ERG leader from Hawaiian Asian Pacific Islanders. We extended the work in her actual function, Caroline Leeugan here, to help develop a partnership with APIA Votes to bring what was going to be a presidential town hall forum for the API community in this past summer, before our properties were closed. She and other ERG members from HAPA have expanded the work around naturalization, voter registration, as well to different properties around mostly the Western states. So this is very direct inroads in how we have continued to and since evolving awareness around voter rights and encouraging voter registration as well as census participation this past year. And of course, more clearer activities around the ERGs might have been around the passage of marriage equality or the ruling of SCOTUS years ago, activating our LGBT ERG around campaigns and around wedding events with our weddings chapels. We have a whole number of wedding chapels that we're looking to grow the business around Las Vegas and in other markets as well. So there's lots of crossovers that we look to point the ERGs to that have this intersection around CSR or advocacy in that earlier slide I shared. Next slide. This next slide is a little bit more explicit, right? So you've got naturally a lot of intersectional interest amongst ERG leaders, but as a company, what we try to do is ensure, I think we're at this next generation of how do we evolve all these positions and initiatives that we've spoken up for or testified for at a state or federal level, essentially over the last 15 years. I think we're moving to the stage of to what extent does a company who speaks out on these things actually have a updated strategy with legs, roots, authentic investments in some of these areas. So it's something that I think we and other companies should be aware of. While I'm happy, for example, that more CEOs are speaking about some of the social injustice and racial equity issues, the question is to what extent will these companies be performing actual outcomes and change, like real change beyond, including and beyond philanthropy in the next several years. I think this is where we're headed in terms of updating our DEI strategy with that CSR intersection as well. And this is how we've evolved. Some of the things in 2020, Economic Equity Tour happened to be created in 2018 in attaching our diverse suppliers and nonprofits to help to build capacity building throughout the United States, about 8 or 10 different markets. We want to build more, build larger and stronger minority certified businesses in the markets that we operate. That was, how do we evolve some of these multi-year programs into a more updated era today through our partnerships with the ERGs. It's where we're heading. Next slide. I got one or two more. All right, so this is kind of my thoughts, my ending thoughts. What is the future role of ERGs, and particularly in our company? Last year we pulled together an unusual level of CDOs and CDOs as well as CEOs of these different partners nationally, and our corporate partners, our large vendors here in a very exclusive summit. But some of the outcomes around that summit happened to be very self-curated, a group of 50, things such as the racial equity white paper around ESG, which was since published as well. Just have some feedback. We're also looking to be a sounding board for some of the national organizations looking at service sector, and to what extent should they have required ROI from their global awards around racial equity as well. So really shifting that into a sounding board. I think the question is for the ERGs, right, to what extent should they or could they be driving, affecting, or a sounding board on some of the broader intersectional multi-sector standards or multi-sector collaborations that we or other companies are a part of. It's really an evolution that we're trying to identify. For example, right, Brands for Good is very much of a sustainability organization driven era, mostly around environment, but they're now shifting more to racial equity. A lot of the companies who are part of Out and Equal or part of, say, very core DI supplier organizations like WeBank and MSDC are also part of Brands for Good. But the question is, what role should or could the ERGs also play in these cross-sector collaborations that are looking at growing the work out of the traditional pillar of sustainability as well? So I'll leave you with that thought and turn it back over to Phil or Jennifer on the last couple of questions.
Thank you, Gwen. Yeah, that was incredible. We do have some Q&A too for the last 10 minutes for Phil and Gwen and me as well. And I'm just looking at what's been voted up here in our question list and coming through this. In looking at these, Phil, have you glanced at them, and is there anything you'd like to tackle in particular? If you can see them.
Yeah, I've glanced at them. Let's see. Well, why don't we start with the first one? I think that's a good one for you, and it has the most votes, Jen. So what does the life cycle look like for the progression? On average, how long does it take?
Oh, I love that question. This is back to the, and I'm not going to answer it in an easy way because I think there's probably no answer that's true across the board. I think, your ERG's work to be a strategic partner, to me, it depends. If you've grown through grassroots and you haven't had a formalized strategy that is viewed as business aligned, that can take a long time to build that trust in the organization. Sometimes paradoxically, when you start ERGs fresh, and you can leverage a lot of what we've learned about how they're most successful, you can build them in a different way if you're starting now versus if you've had them for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, like a lot of the companies have here. And so I guess I could say that, really it's about being diligent about moving along that maturity curve and being really intentional and running it like you are running a strategy in any other part of the business, which I know is difficult. It's easier said than done with all of the vicissitudes of, business changes and chaos and emerging issues like this summer and, so much disruption. And I think that the most ERGs can really think about to accelerate your maturity curve is the relevance that you bring, right? The knowledge you bring, the customer insights that you can unlock, the talent insights that you can unlock and enable, the extent to which you can understand other functional goals and objectives and the what's in it for me, the WIFM, right? We exist, I think, to not only serve our constituency, but also to be an incredible driver with our partners. And so I think that that's a new, for some of us and work in companies where ERGs aren't seen that way. And so we might be seen as the food, fun, and famous people, the cocktail party people, the pride celebration, but not much more than that. If you really ask your stakeholders, what do you think of when you think of us? So there's a branding challenge that I think only we know in terms of, how are we perceived? And if you don't know the answer to that, I might recommend, doing a survey, both qualitative and quantitative, to understand how is our value proposition understood in the organization? Because I think it's important to build from where you are and not have some sort of concept of where you are and how you're perceived and where you are in the progression model. I think the only message that matters is the one that's received. And so I think we need to start from the outside in and look at ourselves, take a hard look. It's just like inclusive leadership, and each one of us, and probably the deep dive we're all doing right now into like, who am I? Am I practicing inclusion in the way that I want to? And what's most important is how it's perceived by others. And so, ERGs exist in this context, and we have to be really pretty calculating about growing our seat at the table and making sure that it is a viable and healthy seat at that table and a sustainable seat at that table. So yeah, thank you for the question. If you are curious about our ERG work to help ERGs move along this maturity curve, please send me an email at info@jenniferbrownconsulting.com. And we do a lot of this work and we really love it. And we know so much about ERGs and how they operate. And it's a total pleasure to support the work that all of you do. And I consider myself kind of a part of that whole world, even though I've worked for myself for a long time. So thanks for the question. Others, Phil or Gwen, do you see any that you'd like to take?
I would say there's a lot. Phil, I'm going to refer to you. I'm also wearing two different glasses things. So
right. So I think
admittedly.
Yeah, I think one that we could all answer is, what's your smoking gun or ace in the hole stat that you would suggest to a board that's so compelling, even the least progressive members want to support DEI&B? And so if that's a board of directors or if that's an executive board for an ERG, either way, I think somebody else had a great session on advocacy yesterday. The folks from Altria and some others were on that as well. I highly recommend going back and watching that one, because one of the things that they focus on is how audience centricity is important. And I think this is important for making a business case as well. You need to know your audience and know what is going to resonate with them. And for the CFO, it's going to be something different than for the chief human resource officer. And that's going to be potentially something different for the CEO. And it's going to be something potentially different for the chief operating officer. So different constituencies, and for board members, different constituencies are going to have different things that are going to be most compelling to them, whether it's data or stories or personal anecdotes or stuff around risk or stuff around HR or talent value or stuff around stock performance. And so know your audience is my first key directive. Figure out what's going to be compelling to them and what's going to resonate with them, and then cherry pick the stat or data that is connected to that. And for a board of directors, financial performance is often a key thing, as well as talent. And so looking at some of the stats around financial performance, the McKinsey research that shows the outperformance, I think, is really compelling. And there's a bunch of great talent research that shows that diverse companies. And then another one that I think is going to be compelling to almost any audience is the real dynamic of better inclusion and belonging and diversity, the impact of that on innovation, because innovation drives a whole bunch of other things as well. So those would be my three, but again, it depends on the audience. And Gwen and Jen, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that as well or want to tackle a different question.
Yeah, I saw a question what 8 votes around the intersection of DEI training, or what the intersection could be, or maybe empathy. I really see the conscious inclusion training as a starting point, right? And then the reinforcement point being these probably smaller actions of engagement. And for us, it might be the DEI aspects of WeSpire, which used to be environmental only, but WeSpire has these tools, and it's like literally 5 minutes of commitments around anti-racism. Or if you have a site, for us, maybe it's Mississippi, and they might be celebrating a day around veterans. And so it's the conscious inclusion around the biases around veterans at work, right? Oftentimes you speak up to veterans and they are concerned about being out, right? Because the common concerns around that they perceive to be biases against PTSD or other aspects of being a veteran. So thinking about it, it could be starting point and then smaller chunks around pieces that will grow empathy, right, over time. And then how do you thread through these sides around, we're doing a year in advance of town halls, virtual town halls around the country. So beyond the conscious inclusion, these town halls around Noble, our Black police chiefs, happens to be a long-time partner. So we're partnering them up with our VP and SVP, the forum. These are Black male executives internally, and Chorus, our Black ERG. So how do we thread through these conversations as learning points, whether it be chunks of an hour or chunks of 5 minutes, going beyond those 6 hours of training, right? So it's a thread through, it's a journey, and it's reinforcing over probably many years for empathy. And I'm looking at the training expert there, but other than that, are there other questions? I think we got 3 more.
Gwen, was there a tool you mentioned? There's a question in chat.
Oh, it was WeSpire. They used to be known as Practically Green. Susan Hunt Stevens expanded her work a few years back to community and social environmental sustainability. So we added, Caesars added aspects of well-being and health. They now have a large channel on diversity and inclusion. You can customize these pieces. Many times the D&I and the HR and sustainability people buy different modules from them, but that's a tool that we found more so for reinforcing. And essentially you want to have fun, right, in learning and gamifying, and it's a way to reward activities around it.
It's called can you spell it again?
WeSpire, WESPIRE.
Got it. Perfect.
Fire is great. Highly endorse them as well. Susan is wonderful.
Thank you.
And then I've seen other sessions go over their time. So if people want to stay on and do more Q&A, we can, but let's just go to the next 2 slides for 1 second first before we hit the top of the half hour. So we have an activity and exercise for you to help focus these thoughts as you head back to your day job and your gay job or your passion job or however you want to phrase it. And these are in the file section of our session on Pathable, both a Word version and a PDF version. So feel free to download this, use this with your teams, reach out to any of us for help. I think we're all in this together, so we're all happy to help think about this. And then lastly, on the final slide, we've got our contact information again. So, and we'll throw this in the chat as well. But really appreciate everybody's active engagement in the chat. I've been talking too much, so I haven't been able to read all of it, but I'm going to go back and save it and read through it. It looks like a lot of great ideas. And like we said before, we will add the answers to the Slido polls to the deck, and then share the deck on the Pathable platform, as well as sharing it directly with folks who have pinged or emailed us.
Great. Thank you. And with that, it's right on the nose, on time. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Phil and Gwen, and thank you, Veronica. Let's give her a round of applause for the management of polls and things. Yes, it's one of our first trial runs with Slido, and we're really enjoying it. So yeah, thank you, everybody. And this is such an important topic. And I hope that you consider this to be an investment in your growth and the growth of your network and the way we talk about D&I. To be always more strategic, always more tied to other things as a driver, all the things we know it is, but I think that we need to develop this discipline and this understanding, these frameworks in ourselves, and we need to be armed with all the connection points so that when we are at that table, we use that time and we maximize that time with business partners so that we can get forward together. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Reach out to any of us. I know that Phil and Gwen are some of the most generous professionals I know, and they really mean it when they say they'd love to hear from you. So thanks for joining us today, and maybe I'll see a couple of you in my next session in half an hour.